Hello everyone, and welcome to my patch 13.23 mid lane tier list. Now, patch 13.23 was pretty small. If you go to the patch notes, you can see that not a whole lot was changed, and thus as a result, our tier list hasn't changed a whole lot, but there have been a few kind of important changes here and there. So I'm going to go through and kind of highlight all the important changes. If you do want explanation for every champion on the list, I kind of talked about pretty much everything already in my 13.22 tier list, so I'll link that in the description. If you're wondering about why any champ on the list is where it is, I would go check out that video. But let's kind of go through the changes that are relevant to this patch. So our first big change is the Azir mini rework, which basically was that they made it so on hits applied at a 50% rate. You can read that here, only to the primary target, and that meant that he could utilize some of the other builds and kind of incentivized him to use more on hit items. Now, I would say overall that this is a nerf, and the main reason Azir is used in the current meta is as a response to Orianna. So Orianna, strongest champ on the patch, and Azir would do decently into her because you could go Hail of Blades, which gives you Taste of Blood, extra sustain, particularly important after the Corrupting Pot nerfs. It's also one of the best champs at ganking in a mobile Orianna, while also being able to just, generally survive the lane and then kind of outrange her in the mid to late game. So it was a really good answer for that reason. I think now it's not as good. So there's still builds that work, right? Like you can still go Luden's Hail of Blades, and that allows you to kind of be less W reliant and poke her out. So you can still do that. I think overall, though, the builds have kind of, it feels like the best build, if it's a good game for it, is to go like Nash's Rush and then into Leandry or something. But the problem is, well, one, you lose a lot of power in the laning phase against Orianna, so then you kind of lose your niche as this Orianna answer. And also, they just aren't super tanky comps in solo queue at the moment. At least I don't run into that many. So it kind of feels like Azir has just lost a lot of his power. I don't think he's weak by any means, and I think you're still seeing him in a lot of high elo solo queue, but I would honestly say if you're not very high elo, he's probably not as worth playing as before, and if you weren't using him specifically as an Orianna counter, I think he's also lost quite a bit of value there. Next change is something that you guys might find really interesting, which is Hail of Blades Ekko. So Hail of Blades Ekko, I could move it around a little bit on this list, but let me just explain it to you first. So Hail of Blades Ekko was an old answer to Syndra. Obviously, you guys probably know if you've watched League a long time that Ekko itself was an answer to Syndra for a very long time. The reason being that Ekko could trade ults with Syndra. Similar to Akali, Ekko also has a lot of mobility, so you can dodge a lot of the skill shots, and just generally you'd be able to neutralize the Syndra lane. Kind of over time though, Syndra just generally became too strong in lane and kind of too hard to push out, and Ekko's wave clear got nerfed more and more. The Ekko kind of fell off as a Syndra answer, and then I think it was around like season 9 or season 10 that Hail of Blades Ekko cropped up, which is where you would start E, you would just E onto the Syndra at level 1, and you would just kind of, beat the crap out of her pretty much, right? But now, or at least in between that time, before the Syndra rework, the problem was that Syndra just ended up so strong in lane. At some point, they buffed the damage on her Q, I believe. And obviously, when it was a 4-second cooldown, she was just extremely strong in lane. And that made it even harder for Ekko, a champion that kind of struggles in lane, to be able to do that. Because if you E onto her and you lose a trade just by taking a Q and taking orders on the way out, it was never worth it. So you kind of just saw, the Hail of Blades Ekko completely disappear, right? Now Hail of Blades Ekko is back, so Syndra now with the rework has a 7-second cooldown on her Q at level 1, and also she is just a little bit weaker in lane, like a lot of her power is more towards the scaling side of things. So the reason Ekko is being used, aside from those as more of a counter pick now, is that a lot of the time, what happens in high elo at the moment is Ori will get banned, right? Because she's very OP. And then people are kind of looking towards something like the Syndra. Now, most of the Syndra players will ban Akali because it's probably the worst matchup for her. And so at that point, the kind of champs you're looking for are, something like a Sylas or a Yone and, something like an Ekko. So the Sylas is a bit more reliant on having a ganking jungler because, in the 1v1, it's not particularly great. Yone is not an option if you need an AP champ, right? It's strictly AD. Obviously, it's mixed damage, but it's generally better as an, if you have AP on your team already, Yone is much better. So if you need kind of an AP champ where you don't have a ganking jungler, what are you looking at? It kind of means you can't pick LeBlanc because, again, needs a ganking jungler. You could go something like Ahri. Ahri is a good neutralizer, but also kind of works better with a ganking jungler. So that's when people are now looking towards something like the Ekko. So I do think Ekko actually has a niche crafted out for himself, which is as a Syndra answer when Akali is banned and when you don't have a ganking jungler. So that made me move him up pretty far on the list, because a lot of the time when I am making these lists, it's not so much that the champs below are weak, it's more that they don't have a niche or that the champs above them are just stronger. But there is actually a crafted out niche for Ekko now. Would I say he's like a super strong mid laner? Probably not, but I think you could move him higher up in the list, right? Like I think you could make an argument that because he, counters one of the, or is an answer to one of the strongest champs in the patch, that he deserves to be up here. Personally, I'm just going to leave him here because I'm not sure exactly where you would put him, but I honestly don't think it matters. Like I think that's the way you use Ekko, and if you guys have any thoughts on where in B tier you think he should be, happy to hear it, but overall, that's what I think Ekko should be used for. Next one is Naafiri. So I've moved Naafiri down a little bit. I feel like the nerfs were pretty heavy-handed, and I think it was already a champ that sort of struggled in high-elo, but was mainly nerfed because it was a low elo stomper. It's a very simple to play assassin. It also scales very well. I am a little surprised in the direction they went with Naafiri because I think this is, one of the coolest design champs that Riot has had in a while, but unfortunately they've kind of just made it too much of a noob stomper maybe. So if they could increase perhaps some of the skill expression or something, that could be a way to do it and to make her, viable in high elo and without being overbearing in low elo. But yeah, for now, she's definitely moved down on the list, and I think other AD mids overall are stronger. Another one that I've added to this list for kind of a niche reason is Lucian. So Lucian mid has been kind of weak for a pretty long time at the moment, and honestly he still is kind of weak, but he does have some answers to specific champions. So those would be Jace and Tristana. So when your opponent is blind picking AD mid, it's very likely that it is going to be Jace or Tristana, right? Because like the blindable AD mids tend to be like the range ones and tend to have like a bit of mobility. Obviously Tristana's W and the phase rush disengage that comes from Jace. They're much more blindable than a champ like Yone, for example. And Lucian happens to do quite well into both these champs. I think Lucian is a counter to Jace. I think Lucian is also a counter to Tristana. So it's mainly going to be when you need an AD counter pick mid, because, there's plenty of mages that already counter these, right? Like if someone blinds Jace or Trist and you need an AP champ, that means you can play something like the Syndra or the Cassio or an Ahri or something. Pretty much anything that has CC is going to really shut it down. Even a Victor or a Lux, Talia, like all of these can work. But when you need an AD champ into Jace or Tristana, it's actually a lot harder to pick because Tristana, pretty much destroys almost any AD champ, any melee AD champ in lane. And then Jace, honestly, is just kind of good against anything that doesn't super hard outrange him. So Lucian just happens to be a champ that can do well into these. How often will this come up? Honestly, probably not that often unless you're playing at high-low, but I think it's worth mentioning on the list, again, just as, as having a niche counter pick scenario. Another thing I want to clear up before we move on to the matchups is the C tier. So C tier, in my mind, all these champions are similar strength and are pretty interchangeable, or rather they can be moved around depending on what you're playing against, right? So in my opinion, all these C tier champions are or should be used as counter picks. I don't think you want to blind them. And depending on, what your opponent blinds and what comp you see kind of influences, how strong the champ is. Like for example, if you have a champ like Galio and your team is picked full engage, then suddenly Galio is extremely valuable. You play Galio with something like Camille and Rakan, Jarvan. Galio might shoot up all the way to A tier or S tier, right? But if you're just picking Galio all the time, it's probably not super valuable. Then let's go to the other end and look at a champion like Corki. So overall, Corki is not that strong, but if you are versing like a free matchup where you can just scale for free, or you're playing against a short range comp that has no sustain, you can poke them out in the mid game, or just against a bunch of tanks, then you might actually find that Corki is a lot better, and could he be at the top of C tier? Sure. Could he even be in B or A? Possibly in that game. So don't read too much into where the champs are placed in C tier. I honestly could just rename C to counterpick because I think that's what they're used for. A lot of these champs are, if you can get away with them, they're good, like scaling from ASOL or Kassadin, Karthus, Vega, stuff like that. But the kind of current meta matchups make it too difficult to do so. But again, if you can find good situations to play these champs, it's not that they're necessarily weak. And you could move them around in the C tier pretty much however you like, and I'd still be happy with it. But the main kind of reasoning behind them being here is that they shouldn't really be blind picked, and there are normally champions that do their job better. Finally, I want to give you guys some general advice, just some kind of guidelines, I guess, for how I think about champs in the current pick ban, and kind of like which champ you should prioritize beyond just like, what is the highest on the tier list. Obviously, you should prioritize comfort, like if you can't play the champs, don't worry about it. But I'll just kind of run through my general order of operations for kind of, what we're looking at the moment. So firstly, if we're blind picking and Orianna is open, I will probably go for her. Like I think overall Ori is one of the safer blinds while also being quite strong. You could get a theoretically safer blind, something like the Ahri, but you are also giving up a bit of champion strength and potentially giving your opponent, a free Syndra or a free Ori or something, which we don't really want. So I would normally go for this if it's not banned. After that, you can blind Syndra. I think Syndra blind is still also fine. It does have some bad matchups, and I think if you're more looking to blind Syndra often, I would recommend banning Akali, or maybe banning something like Fizz or Aurelia. It really depends like what you run into too often. Personally, I would probably go for the Akali ban. Then Jace is the next one. So Jace obviously is just the premier AD blind. The thing you have to be careful about Jace is that Jace is actually quite hard into both Ori and Syndra at the moment. So Ori's into Jace typically go the Comet build, and that's very, very hard to deal with. So in that matchup, you want to probably go like Phase Rush Second Wind and just, you know, play to survive pretty much and poke her out in the mid game. You can sometimes punish if she uses her ball too far forward. You know, you can Q on her and stuff. Jace versus Syndra, I think, is also a pretty hard matchup. If the Syndra plays it well, she can hold her E, which makes it hard. Again, in the mid game, you have kind of a win con where you can just poke her out and she doesn't have any sustain, but she does outscale you, in my opinion, at least in pure teamfight DPS, and the lane is quite hard. So if you are going Jace, I would recommend... Okay, if you don't play one of these, I'd probably ban one and just like hope you don't play against the other. Alternatively, if you can play Jace and then you have like pressure onto mid, like if you're playing Jace Evelyn, for example, even if you're countered by Syndra, it'll probably be fine, right? So this is kind of the best champs. Then onto our kind of next, I'm mainly talking about the A tier here. So like Akali obviously is the premier answer to Syndra. It's very, very good, mainly because obviously all that movement speed is super nice. And it just goes a really long way. You know, like you can't really be pushed out of lane. It's very difficult for her to team fight into you. You can rush Merc Treads if you want. Basically, there's just so many things that make the game difficult for Syndra as Akali. Another thing is that like most Syndras at the moment are going first strike, which makes your lane even easier. That being said, like I still think Syndra outscales Akali. It's really, you've got to make use of the mid game and the side laning and stuff like that. Sylas like definitely worth picking if you have good ults or if you have a ganking jungler, right? Especially into these like immobile mids. I would be very careful blinding Sylas. In fact, I'd pretty much never blind Sylas. I think there are lots of bad matchups. Yone is like a greedier AD pick. I don't pick Yone that much personally, but he is good versus mobile mages if you have, again, gank set up in your jungle, or you just like have a roaming support or something. Like if you pick Yone into something like Ori and you don't have the ability to pressure mid, you're probably going to lose lane. But if you pick Yone and you have, I don't know, like let's say some threatening AP jungler like an Evelyn again, and you have also roaming support like a Rel or something, then you can make it work. I think it's mainly dependent on your jungle support, unless you have like a relatively free matchup, right? Like if your opponent is blind picking poorly, you know, they blind something like, I don't know, an Ari or maybe one of the champs even lower on the list, you can oftentimes get away with a free Yone. Azir, again, I don't think Azir is worth picking as much on the current patch. I guess I would maybe go it... I think I would pick Azir into Ori if Syndra was too unsafe. So, like, let's say they had Orianna Jarvan. It's probably too hard to play Syndra, even though Syndra is actually a pretty decent matchup into Ori. In fact, one of the better ones. It would just be too hard to play, I think, because of the jungler. So I'd kind of think about that. Ahri also can be an option. I think Ahri is pretty hard versus Ori, but Ahri versus Syndra is playable, especially if you start W and you kind of really try and hard bully early on in the lane. It also gives you a bit of safety. You're definitely playing a bit more for utility though, and I don't think you're expecting to win the lane. Another champ that you kind of have to win in the mid game because Syndra will outscale you. Vex is kind of a weird one. I mean, I don't pick Vex that often. Like, it's not really in my current meta champion pool. If I were to play Vex at the moment, it would probably be because someone blinded something greedy. So something like a Yone that I could punish, or maybe even a Jace. Like, I think Vex into Jace is pretty good if you don't want to play one of the other champs. So yeah, personally not a champ I use much, but can have value. Lissandra is really, really good. Again, if your opponents are blinding poorly, like if you see blind Akali or blind Zed or blind Fizz, pretty much any blind assassin, Lissandra is immediately your go-to. Tristana. So Tristana is my pick when they kind of blind something. It's like you need an AD mid, but you also need mobility. So like it's kind of hard to get AD mids with good mobility, right? Like again, let's say you verse Orianna Jarvan. Jace is not particularly safe against that, like, right? Even though he has the phase rush and the E, it's not going to survive Ori Jarvan. So that's a time where you might go Tristana. I would say, though, that this is just going to be difficult for pretty much whatever champ. Like, you could play something like a Zed, but I think the problem is then that Ori outscales and wins the lane, and I feel like then you're kind of just picking to survive rather than, like, counterpicking, which feels like kind of a poor use of counterpick. Honestly, I would consider dodging against Orianna Jarvan, but that's probably when your Tristana is an option. Neeko, I think Neeko is... Well, personally, I don't play a lot on Neeko, but the time that I see people pick Neeko is when they're against, again, kind of like champs that either can't take D-Shield second win, so they can't sustain it all back up, or don't really have any other access to sustain. So, like, if you play Neeko versus a champ like Ahri, for example, you know, Ahri has sustain on her kit, she has Taste of Blood, she has second win, so even though Neeko can win the lane, it's like you're never going to really do enough that Ahri becomes useless, right? Like, the champ has sustain and she has utility from behind. Now, if you pick... Neeko into a champ like Syndra, you know, I think the matchup itself is not amazing for Neeko, right? It's like I don't know, champion-wise, Syndra actually counters Nico, but like Syndra is a good example of a champ that can't really get sustained, and has like fairly long cooldowns now with the 7 seconds on the Q. So Nico could actually poke out this lane a lot. I would actually say Nico is better though against champions like Talia, because Talia is just kind of feels like Syndra, like the same weaknesses that Syndra has of being immobile, not having sustain, stuff like that. But just like a much weaker laning phase, so Nico can really take advantage of that. Again, personally, I don't play a lot of Nico, so I just don't really pick her that much, but you're probably looking to punish some of these like lower tier picks on the list that especially that don't have sustain in the lane. And the last one that's kind of in my pool at the moment, I would say, well, there's a couple. I'd say LeBlanc. So LeBlanc is good against the mobile mids when you have gank set up. It's quite good versus Jace. It's risky versus Ori, but it's like, if you have really good gank setup, it can work. Again, risky versus Syndra with good gank setup, it can work. I'd say the main reason I picked LeBlanc is just like versus Jace, or if someone blinds something that's not good, so like a Yone or an Akali or a Sylas or something that kind of feels free. And then the only other champs that I currently use a lot in my champion pool is Talia as a counter to melees, kind of self-explanatory. Cassio also as a counter to melees. Yeah, I'd say that's like kind of the end of my champion pool. So that's like my advice for you guys at the moment. Of course, like prioritize your comfort above everything, but that's just like my general way of thinking about the current picks at the moment. And obviously that influences what champs I think are strong, right? Like a lot of these champs happen to be in my champion pool naturally. Some of them are not. I don't play like a huge amount of Yarn, I don't play a huge amount of Sylas at the moment, but I still think they're very strong, and I still think I know the reasons for picking them. But yeah, hopefully that was helpful. Let me know if that kind of insight into how I'm picking helps at all. Otherwise, yeah, I think that'll be it. Let me know what your thoughts are on the general tier list. If you did like the video, go ahead and like and subscribe. I'll see you in the next one.